Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support the channel on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is our 5th episode of the political commentary. I asked some people on my YouTube community, if they liked what we were doing. Florian, they more or less, it's a pretty popular show. So that's really great. Today we're talking about the influence of the trans movement on our political landscape. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here, but I think let's start with, I guess, current events. Right now, we've already talked about Charlie Kirk on the roundtable, and I'm personally not convinced about this whole Tyler Robinson angle. It sort of seems like a patsy move. But without going into too many details, this is where a lot of the trans movement, the trans shooters come in. I mean, obviously, we do have a legitimate trans shooter, i.e., we know that this person did it. That's what I mean. With Minneapolis a month ago, right? And where the Catholic school was tragically shot up. In which case, so we know that's for real, which is why the Tyler Robinson thing has legs. People see it. There was also the Nashville trans shooting in 2023 and the reformed school, which killed, I think, two children and 2 teachers. But in this case, I don't think you can pin it on the trans. As I mentioned already in the roundtable, that seems like a plant. And then furthermore, recently I heard news that some guy was arrested for faking a shot on Charlie Kirk to help the real shooter get away. And I'm like, okay, this whole thing has already fallen apart a long time ago. But what it does say is, from my POV, even if they're going to run with this angle of a trans shooter as a patsy to sort of like say, okay, this person killed Charlie Kirk, it shows you how much cachet it has in the political landscape, that this is something that someone would do, right? And I think it shows us at least 2 things. One is the complete supplanting of feminism, right? I predicted a few years back that the transgender movement would completely replace feminism. It has. And then the second thing is it creates this, from the point of view of right-wing commentators, this sort of inexplicable force in politics and in the escalating tensions across the country that they can't comprehend or react to, which from the point of view of the left, or more broadly, which I would consider the deep state, that's good, because they want to use these devices that the conservatives have a hard time reacting to. And so I'll leave it handed off to you now, Florian. That's sort of my initial statements.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that the guy was, how should we call it, Trantifa, for lack of a better word, affiliated.
Oren McIntyre used the term Tranissaries. I like that a lot.
Yeah, so Tranissaries touches on a different aspect, right? The Janissaries, if I remember correctly, were Christian children that were kidnapped by the Muslims during their conquest of Europe, and then they basically were castrated and drilled in grown, like, educated and brought up in the Muslim belief system, and they became the strongest. Basically became the honor guard of any Islamic ruler. Then those were the Janissaries, and sometimes they were given up for economic or for economic reasons by the parents, or for reasons that they could basically then avoid the wrath of the Islamists when they took over the city, and so on. And on his interview, Oren said something similar, which fits the name of Tranissaries, that also parents give their children voluntarily up. There was this case of the doctor in Texas, I forgot his name, but his wife had basically, they were divorced, and his wife had basically tried to dress their boy as a girl, and get her through, or get him through, hormone treatment, for transitioning. And then she moved to California, where this now all of a sudden was also legal, and the father couldn't do anything, right? That is an example of parents voluntarily giving up their children to yeah to transgender surgery, right? And then in other cases, the children later when they grow up, they get radicalized. Some people say during college, which has an effect, but people have also pointed out that maybe teachers aren't that influential after all. They're just like fellow travelers in the trans movement or whatever left wing movements they have, but they're really radicalized by platforms like Discord and Reddit and others like Twitch and Steam and all these new social media platforms. And on Discord, you can have your own group with own people discussing things. And the transgender groups on Discord are pretty strong. And if we also think back on what we talked about in stochastic terrorism episode a few days back, it's basically that you often have the FBI infiltrating those groups and trying to catch the evil guys, but then becomes the borders between we do that to catch a criminal versus we do that to egg them on for our own causes. Those, of course, those boundaries are very murky, right? And I think in some countries in the world, for example, in Finland, it's not allowed for the state police to lie. But in America, the FBI can lie to you. That's not, they can absolutely do that. And so then you create a problem of entrapment also, right? So this all plays together. If you use the Discord angle and say, you know, they're radicalizing children, the FBI may play a role in that. Hell, there are probably a lot of sympathetic fellow travelers within the FBI, which, for all I know, could actually be divided as well, right? There are career servants in the FBI who take their job serious and are pro-America and everything, and then they're left wingers that try to push their own cause forward, right? That's very likely. And so I think whether the shooter was was a transgender. I think he wasn't transgender himself, but adjacent to a transgender. He lived with a roommate who was a transgender, and supposedly that roommate and with an old transgender terror cell egged him on. Whether that's true or not, it's still in general a danger. Those are disgruntled people that usually hate society, or to a larger extent than other people. They are often mentally ill, and then you have people that throw tantrums. I know we don't even need to look at people killing others. Like there was this guy in the store that said like, "It's ma'am," and then he threw a tantrum, or she, whatever, threw a tantrum and knocked over like displays and everything. And then there was another person, also transgender, and he or she, they threatened. Now I'm using word themselves. They threatened Ben Shapiro. So basically, the guy told Ben Shapiro that he would go outside and beat him up after the show. And Ben Shapiro isn't exactly like a muscular guy, and he was standing his ground or sitting his ground on the couch, and that was very violently uncalled for, I would say. And so you get the impression that, and especially, it seems especially prevalent in male to female transgender, right? Men that want to be women, they seem to be more violent than women that want to be men. That's also an aspect that maybe we want to talk about, but there hasn't been talked about very often, that there is differences in transgender, right? So male to female transgender are usually very violent, whereas the female to male transgenders seem to be not to be. But I don't know. Maybe one of the school shooters was a female to male transgender.
So real quick, the Nashville shooting in 2023 was female to male, and that was
Okay, so it could very well be that something, people say, the gender, like sex is assigned by birth, but gender is different of that. And then people say, you can have XY chromosome and still have an overabundance of female hormones, right? Which would basically feminize you and basically turn you into a female. But then you could also say, well, maybe there's an aspect of mental illness that these people have, right? And people also say, and I partially agree with that when they opened up the insane asylums, that wasn't really a win for society, because now people who would need treatments are basically have to now face the world out in the open, and they may not be able to do that, and then they become depressed, and some of them may even think they are a different gender to try to solve their problems, and so on, right? So that also plays a role, and we can say basically that all has been a project of the left wing, in a way, right? Open up the asylums, and love, 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 and everyone is understood, and everyone is allowed to participate, which had some unintended consequences, or maybe they were intended in the end. But I think it's a very complex topic, and there were many unintended consequences of opening up society and abolishing traditional rules and everything.
Yeah, so I tend to, because I'm a philosopher, go from the basic cause of a thing and then work down the chain. So let's start with the ideas. Okay, so I'm going to argue, and I've argued this before elsewhere, that the feminist movement, as it began in the early 19th century, created a mental, sort of inevitable completion of ideas, which will get you to the transgender movement. How is that? Well, so if we look at philosophy, there's a concept called biological essentialism, which says that, okay, a male of the human, let's use humans, it could also be true of animals as well, that there are certain obvious biological features between the human male and the human female that are distinct and they're not changeable. That's called biological essentialism. Pretty much everybody believed that up until, maybe 100 years ago. Throughout all of history, it's just not they didn't have a fancy term for it, but that's what it was. The feminist movement says we don't like that society is ordering our social relations based on our biology. They want to be like, no, we don't have our place in society shouldn't be determined by our biology. Okay, well, here's the thing though, right? If you say that, then what you're saying is a woman is just socially constructed, because in society, it's whatever you say it is, completely independent and devoid of your biological realities. Well, it doesn't take any great imagination to realize that the next step is to say, well, wait a minute. Do biological realities at all even matter in determining what a woman is? Right? Because we've already established it in society when we define roles and social relations and social hierarchies that we're not supposed to consider biology. You've functionally created a artificial construct of womanhood that's plastic and malleable to whatever the current iteration of technology needs. Now, why not just go one step further and just say, well, you know what? Why do we even care? Since the biology doesn't actually inform the social realities, why even care about the biology at all? Why not just say, this is how I feel? Because why not, right? You've already established that precedent and you can't fight it. So, for example, when the transgender movement got really big from like 2018 on, I remember black pill authors, from the manosphere, saying that this was kind of like a covert revenge of men, because men who claimed to be transitioning to the female would just flood female spaces, chat groups, physical spaces, and then just take it back over. And then, the lesbians and the TERFs are like, no, we don't like that. And it's like, well, what's your defense? You've already established that a woman's role in society is based on feelings. So why not? What is a woman herself based on just feelings? There's no way you can walk this back, and that's why the TERFs at least are losing rhetorically vis-a-vis the trainees, because they're both leftists. They both have the same language landscape in a Foucaultian sense. Yeah, but one's more consistent, right? The other thing is, what's feminism? It's the idea that my true self, this nebulous, ill-defined concept, is being oppressed by society. And we need to change society to let me express my true self. That's transgenderism right there. A man to female, a female to male says, I have a true self that society is denying. It's literally the same thing. It's just a couple steps further along. So all of this is the necessary logical development out of feminist theory based on rejection of biological essentialism and the idea that my body's a prison, this kind of like neo-Gnostic woo-woo. And the problem is, it's already everywhere. It's in the movies, it's in business, it's in workplaces, it's in school. So if you're inundated with that, and you're already, confused or even mentally unstable, you don't have a firm point on which to set your flag on, except how you feel. And you're just going to tell the feminist turf professor, hey, I'm a woman now. What's she going to do? She can't do anything, right? Because you just checkmated her at her own game. And the administration would probably have her fired if she didn't go along with it. So this is where it starts as like a germ, the seed, the germ that grows into the tree. Okay, so Florian.
Yeah, there's an interesting case in Germany where a guy, I don't know whether he was a politician or not, like a normal guy, and I think he was accused for sharing right wing propaganda, and then he all of a sudden declared that he's a woman now. I think Sven Maria Friedrich, her name is clearly a very, like, it's very much tongue in cheek because he still has a mustache and everything, but he declares himself a woman, and so he has to be, if he goes to jail, he has to be put into a female prison, and of course that is not really very attractive to the to the government, but they have little that they can do against that. I would also say though, there are still hierarchies, right? Even if there's no biological realities and everything, everyone can be everything. Well, not quite. I remember I saw like one clip yesterday where Charlie Kirk debated someone about this topic, and so Charlie said, okay, can I be you say I can be anything? So he asked him, how many genders are there? And he said, yeah, there are, the guy he was discussing with some, well, there can be all as many genders as you want to be. Okay, all right, you can be what you want to be. And okay, and Charlie Kirk said, okay, can I be a bobcat? Can I identify as a bobcat? And the guy said, sure, if you want to identify as a bobcat, that's fine. Okay, can I identify as black? And then he saw the guy like,
oh, no.
the guy, I don't think that, right. And so he became really uncomfortable there, and 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 you see that there's a certain hierarchy, right? There's still certain lines that cannot be crossed, which is actually interesting because you had some people claiming to be transracial. That was a thing in around 2015, 2016. You had some, I forgot her name. There was like a very famous, like left wing famous blogger, or like journalist. She had like large, frizzy, wavy, curly hair. I forgot her name. Maybe it's for the better. But she claimed to be black, right? Her parents were both white, but she claimed she was always seeing herself as black. So, and then we get some discussion of transracialism as well.
Real quick, it's Rachel Dolezal.
Exactly, Rachel Dolezal, right? That's her name. Yeah. But that has died down, interestingly, a little bit. So that narrative, transracialism, that is not something that has taken hold on the left. Interesting, huh? But yeah, so there are certain hierarchies that are still being kept intact. And I think also today I read an article by someone who spent 6 months inside Antifa undercover back in 2016, and he said he was close to just blowing his cover because he couldn't take it any longer. Like the weird constructs with which he had to live there, that he almost couldn't take it anymore. But what he observed was that there was a hierarchy internally that not openly spoken out, but if you're a white guy inside of Antifa, they treat you like they're slaves. Like, so it's expected, if there's something heavier to carry, it's expected that the white guys carry it. The white guys can only say something that praises people of color or transgender in the organization. So these guys say to the outside that you can be whatever you want to be. We are tolerant, but inside they have clear hierarchies. And I would say that's normal biology, right? People create some hierarchies because you always have some people that are a little bit ahead of the others, right? and they always form like an hierarchical structure, and those will always end up in, well, in the group internal elite, if you will, right? So that happens automatically, but their branding to the outside is that is just love, love, love. Everyone can be whatever they want to be, but they are anything but, right? So they deny biology. Almost think they do that as a branding stick to somehow gain more power, to convince gullible people that they're just about love and tolerance. And once they have real power, they will strip that off. And another thing is, when you said it was transgenders just meant revenge to go into female spaces, yeah, that's true. But I still do believe you always, if you have look at when there's a crowd of Antifa gathering, and there's like a crowd of like 18 to 20 people, typically 18 women and 2 guys in there, and those guys are always giving themselves like they come across as like sensitive guys, nice guys. That's a mating strategy. Those guys want to go into female spaces to get a girlfriend, right? And they do so in a very misguided manner, but that's their strategy. They're still straight guys. But the people that actually dress like a woman and go into women's bathrooms and stuff like that, and more, maybe they even come across as transgender and say, everyone, you need to call me ma'am and stuff like that. I think they are mentally retarded, because if you're not, you're still retaining your masculine self. I think that maybe I just can't fathom how someone who is clearly a man will just put on a wig and now they can get into a female dressing room. I mean, this is you need to be a little bit nutty to do that. I think a normal person, maybe as kind of a joke, do it once, but if you really do that as a strategy, you have a screw loose. That's what I would say.
There's a couple other ways we can look at this. One is, this is a kind of Foucaultian power game, right? So for Foucault, language is power. It's a dominance game. And if you can get somebody to say something that isn't true, and that they know isn't true, you have just used discourse to create a dominance environment in which you quote, coerced or compelled or convinced that person to say what you want, right? And that is a kind of like language flex. So I think that's part of it. But the other thing, and this is where I'm both surprised and not surprised that the left hasn't gone this way. There was a saying they used to say 20, 30 years ago: follow the money. Well, okay, now there's we can divide this group up into 3 broad categories. There are those that are, quote, hardcore, that go through the surgery and transition. There are those that, like you said, just put on a wig and just put on a dress and pretend. That's like the second group. That's a lot larger. And then there's the fellow travelers, people that just treat this as a civil rights issue and want to be good moral people and just support this, right? So those are the 3 broad groups. This whole ecosystem of the hardcore, the not so hardcore, and the fellow travelers makes a lot of money. Transition surgeries can be as expensive as $100,000. And then furthermore, for the rest of your life, if you have gone through with a transition surgery, is to be on a cocktail of drugs for the rest of your life. So what does this mean? Well, this means you have a captive market, i.e., if this person wants to go through with this procedure, they have to do X, Y, and Z, which is a lot of money. And then for the rest of their life, they have inelastic demand for pharmaceuticals. And inelastic demand just means no matter how much the price goes up or down, you still have to consume it. So a good example of a commodity with inelastic demand is food or gas. But if you've put yourself through this, certain drugs now are part of your inelastic demand, and you are now a permanent, permanently invested in the capitalist system. Now you have to now work, find a way to make enough money to pay for those drugs. It's not exactly like an addict who needs another hit, but it's the same kind of principle, right? And then furthermore, there's lots of money to be made on the, quote, trans identity, unquote, where you buy consumer products, clothes, or or whatever that show that you are this person or that you have solidarity with this person, right? And so now you have a whole economy rooted around creating an identity through consumption. And so what you have, and we've mentioned this before in roundtables, but I'll just end with this. It creates the ideal of what we call, quote, the new American man, where every aspect of this person's life is artificially constructed by the media, by capitalism, by whatever, that they then identify with. So their entire identity is subsumed inside this cash nexus, and nothing exists outside of it because they've decided that all the identities they're going to have, which makes them a perfect consumer. And part of this is just the logic of profit. Sure, some people are steering this, but this is just the commodification of sex as such. And there's a huge market involved that makes this possible. And we need to be clear about this, because for those who go through with transitions, without modern surgery techniques and modern drugs, this would be impossible. This could not exist. So, to use Marxist terms, the material conditions of capital make this possible. It could not exist in any other context. And a lot of people just don't see that.
Yeah, it's a good point that you bring up this Foucauldian language flex, because something that I'm looking into like lately is, so first of all, transitioning as creating inelastic demand. Yeah, that's a good point. It's like the opioid epidemic, right? By any other name, right? You basically get people addicted to anything trans, right? They need to now take chemicals and everything to somehow make it through their lives, which is really despicable. Because for the opioid epidemic, you could still think there was an original good intention, putting people on opioids to reduce their pain, and then people realize, wait a second, no, we can make great money from that, and that's the evil part. And I also want to stress out that that's a completely different topic, but I just want to say that there are people who actually don't want opioids banned, because some people actually do profit from them because they have incredible pain, right? And it's very unfortunate that gets basically, that their needs also get overridden when we try to end the opioid epidemic. That's another collateral damage that any drug epidemics have, right? Because some people need the drugs, and if you make everyone addicted to it, then those people in the end suffer because they don't get their drugs that they really need. But putting that aside, I think it's great that you put up the Foucauldian power game, the language flags, right? Because now we have basically a battle on who feeds AI the most efficient source data, right? If you can have that Foucauldian language flags and feed it in AI somehow, you will increase your power a lot, right? So basically, if you feed AI, all these ChatGPT, LLMs, large language models, if you feed them with source data, and then basically you have websites or other internet presences where you basically show expert studies and have a certain data structure that you employ, have a certain context where you write it so that the AI then thinks you're the expert, then the AI will implement your topics into its engines. And then there will also somebody ask, what is transgenderism? Is that harmful? Then the AI will point you at websites that say, no, it's not harmful, and it's like the future and whatnot, right? Whoever can most effectively train AI to give their version of reality will have an enormous power advantage and monetary advantage in the future. Because imagine in 5-10 years, we already do like a lot of things with AI. Just wait until the 99% of people that still don't use it have caught up, and AI is everything. AI will tell you what happened in the past, except that AI just tells you what it thinks happened in the past and with which it was fed. And at one point, you forget that there were ever two genders. I think that's the real goal of the transgender community and the people that foster it. That basically all the past evidence of right or wrong, of moral is just deleted. Also, truth from the past is just gone, and it gets exchanged against some corporate branding that benefits a certain side, right? So if we don't stop this, then this kind of rhetoric, pro-trans, LGBTQ, all this like transitioning is good and all that, this rhetoric will increase if we don't stop it. Now, it may have gotten like a fatal blow by what happened to Charlie Kirk, but the danger is still there, right? So I believe if we don't do anything decisive in the next future, that can be a big problem, because right now you still have people say that there are two genders, but what in 10 years if the AI tells you they aren't two genders, then people don't tell you that anymore, and then you have then over time you have a real problem in society with almost the inmates running the asylum. I mean, maybe that's a little bit hyperbolic, but something like that could happen, and I think it's very important that we keep the AI angle in mind.
Yeah. So the other thing to sort of tie this further in is and again, you won't really see the left make this analysis anymore in general, but specifically applied to this case, right? The sense that someone self-describes as being gender fluid, i.e., feeling that they have different genders each day, right? And that they're confused about who they are now, or they're alienated from their true self, right? You can ultimately reduce all of this language to alienation from the true self. Well, a classic leftist position would be, no, you're alienated from labor. You're alienated from your labor, right? That would be the classic leftist response. But what happens is these individuals are then redirected into thinking that, no, the alienation they suffer is from having their true self suppressed, which doesn't actually threaten capital at all. In fact, capital provides the identity that they want. And then furthermore, let's use the example of in Dune, the first book, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen has an army of minions who are basically drug addicts. And if he doesn't give them the dose that they need, they'll die of withdrawal. So he's got unbreakable control over them, right? They'd physically die from withdrawal if he didn't give them the hits, right? They're that addicted. So they'll do whatever he tells them to do because, they don't want to die, right? Well, once you go through transgender surgery and you become dependent upon these drugs, you're in exactly the same position, but not vis-a-vis Baron Harkonnen, just vis-a-vis capitalism. And so what that does then is it takes this resentment that could have been directed upwards and then redirects it horizontally. So rather than vertical, it's horizontal. And then furthermore, this person now becomes deeply invested in the system. So, for example, the Marxists would critique and say, well, look, the shop owner, the petite bourgeoisie is invested in the capitalist system because even though they're not in charge, their entire way of life would disappear after the revolution. Yes, but that would also happen with a transgender person because they can only exist in a set of capitalist material conditions. And so through using sex as a political tool, they've created a similar kind of class dependency, though in this case, not based on their mode of work, but on their sexual habits, which that is a huge coup. Like, I'm just like, wow, from the point of view of the capitalists trying to discourage labor activism and general resentment against capital, that's a coup. And the left is just mum's the word, which says a lot.
Yes, and also got the other idea. We should not forget that, how someone said that, I think Justin Garcia from the Pressure Project said that once, they try to force corporations have, like, anything that is unisex is of advantage for corporations because it's a simple cost issue, right? Because they don't need to produce different products for men and women. They can produce the same toys for children because it's all unisex. But it continues. I think gay people are just very affluent consumers because they don't have any family to take care of. Also, in terms of advertising, most if you really want to make money, I think you either sell to the masses or you sell to a niche audience, preferably rich. And like sports cars, for example, would be selling to rich men mostly, right? But if you want to sell to the masses, you sell to women because you can much more emotionally manipulate them or get them into buying, right? So so basically, um, I think I forgot my train of thought. But what I wanted to say is um, yeah, if you have if so families are actually not good for business. The man in the family, especially in a patriarchal family, the man in the family will decide what gets bought, and he will buy some garden utensils, maybe some food, for example, gas, and so on. He will be a most libertarian guy in a way, right? And who doesn't get hung up on like advertisement. It's just has no effect on him, right? He can't be gotten to buy something. So for that reason, destroying the family is of advantage in commercial ways for big corporations. And you know, there's also, in a way, I don't know whether that's really part of that, but I saw a picture on Twitter an X today with like a beautiful landscape in the fall with some American national park, and it's really beautiful with mountains and you know flowers, many different colors. And then somebody said, yeah, but some tech oligarch thinks that's a good place to put a server farm on, right? So anything that is in favor of the land and families and local conservation of nature, that is anathema to a big corporation. They just want to expand. And you know, in that, I think we also talked about in the past about Amazon fulfillment centers. They basically leave a huge crater where nothing commercial works besides besides anything that's connected to Amazon, right? So basically, large corporations destroy families and small businesses, and in that way, uh, supporting the trans movement is in the interest of corporate capitalist America.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can run with this a bit further too, right? So, like you said, a an individual without a clearly defined set of filial relations is the ideal consumer. Well, a gender fluid individual is even better, right? Because that person can buy female line products and male line products and just alternate. And once you create a tailorized social media environment for that person with the concomitant ads, you can just flip a switch back at 1010101 and just manipulate that person's feelings of gender identity, and then get that person to buy whatever you want whenever you want, right? And then if go ahead.
Just a quick as a quick aside, um, and I think we all have seen Jaguars, this vaunted sports car model with lots of traditions, and they all of a sudden brought in the marketing campaign that had weird colors and like this. It basically looked like a gender fluid, transgender stuff. That is an example, right, where corporations try to veer off the traditional path and try to really invest into this trans movement or like gender fluid, whatever, LGBTQ rainbow movement, and basically shun their traditional customers.
Well, and you see, the example I'm talking about is not a public ad that everybody sees on TV. I'm talking about a personalized social media internet space where, and of course, corporations will see what you look at, what you buy, and they'll have tailored ads, right? So if they know your news feed, they can then start feeding you information that frightens you, makes you think that your identity as a trans person is in danger. Well, scared people are more easy to manipulate. For example, to buy product. I mean, look, we see this with conservatives too, right? So what you do is, if you want to sell guns, you can create a fearful political landscape, and all of a sudden, gun sales go through the roof. I mean, it's this masterclass in manipulation, right? And so this really just keeps you on the plantation, if you will, such that you just keep buying what they give you. Now, that's sort of like the meta-analysis, but if you want to get a little more, proactive into like the spook sphere. So last week I did a video on our threat landscape where I talked about, actually that was this week, sorry, where I talked about the different actors involved that caused this pot of political turmoil to keep bubbling over. And one of them is agent provocateurs. And, a lot of people get radicalized, like you said, through Discord, right? And I remember with, wide range of different shooters over the last 10 years, some of them had handlers on Discord that were massaging them into a certain mindset. That could either be a far-right shooter, that could be a Muslim shooter, that could be a trans shooter, right? We've seen examples of all of this. And so the next step, we're now moving from the economy to the national security state. The national security state can view these people as expendable assets, because once you've become embedded in a captive market and you can't stop consuming drugs because you've transitioned, you have no other way of life you could turn to. You're stuck. Like this is your best life now or bust. Any change in the system fundamentally alters your way of life in a way that will be fatal in some cases. And so they're just going to be built into this. And so now they're uber loyalists, right? So for example, Vosh would fall under the category I think I've already mentioned of like trans adjacent. He's not himself that, but he supports the broader movement, the woke left, the synthetic left. But as Caleb Maupin has pointed out, the synthetic woke left is itself filled with spooks who try to feed and control these people. And so if you're, say, a man who transitioned to a woman and you watch all the BreadTube stuff, and, some of these guys are handled by intelligence agents or get money from intelligence agents, and they create this environment of fear, well, all of a sudden you're getting radicalized. Like, oh, well, boy, my way of life is in danger. And, if you keep going down that road, some of these people can be given, access to firearms, or through just stochastic terrorism, where they act on their own without any direct handler, but it's just something that just happens, like a Manchurian Candidate program, and you get the trigger word and boom. And they think and act like this because they have nowhere else to go. This is it. This is, this or bust. So they've become capitalist loyalists to the regime. So now you have leftists who are in favor of a NATO and war with Russia. Quite the turnaround from 2003 and the anti-war protests against Bush in the war in Iraq. Mission accomplished, right? From the point of view of the national security state. Again, those that are actually violent shooters are probably a much smaller proportion of the total number. But that kind of doesn't matter. It's kind of this like stochastic pot that you can just kind of keep stirring. And once in a while, someone's going to jump out. And it just keeps tensions high.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's in general the observation that political extreme movements are basically now teeming with Feds. I remember, and that was Germany. They tried to. It wasn't even the AfD. They had a more far right party in Germany. Still have it. National Democratic Party. No, National Democratic Party of Germany, NPD. And they tried to ban the party, I think, twice, and they could never do that because in the investigations, it turned out that like a large percentage of the people in the NPD were German Feds. And then you really start wondering: are these people just like are they trying to egg on people, or are they actually trying to have a go inside the NPD? There's the borders are really fluent there, right? But in the end, they always have the backing of the state, right? They can basically go inside. They can basically incite someone subtly to commit like a shooting or any other atrocity, and they can always wash their hands off, and they can always leave whenever they want, right? And yeah, I still want to mention that That's something we found like around 2017, 2018. I think I heard it on Roos's forum, Return of Kings. But it bears repeating. If you are in a forum and all of a sudden one guy says, "Hey guys, we need to really do something here. Let's just talk. We need to really put out a signal there." Yeah, that's probably a fact. So don't let yourself be beguiled by people like that. I think every one of our listeners are already like they won't do that, but I think it's prudent to mention that, right? And so these people stir up discontent, and exactly that gets more tension in society, and that will be guaranteeing the at least the employment of many police agents, right? And it may even be something that they subconsciously do, right? They just like, okay, so we let's just heat up the hornet's nest a little bit. Let's stir the pot a little bit to see whether someone pops out that is actually a criminal and we can nab him, something like that, right? It doesn't need to be okay. Let's see how we can increase our power and our reach. It could be like, let's see how we can make more efficient police work in identifying these people by stirring the pot a little bit, right? And the problem is just in the end to say, oh, oops, we didn't know that he became violent. That was not our intention, right? When it may be exactly the intention.
Well, and to keep running with this, right? So back to my earlier point that the sense of alienation these individuals are feeling, a Marxist, a classic leftist, a socialist would have said, well, that's just alienation from labor. Why are you bringing sex into this? Well, the reason why capitalism and the national security state would like that to happen is because it personalizes the problem, right? Rather than looking at your alienation and directing it at the owners of the means of production, you view it as other individuals of the same class status who don't call you by your preferred pronoun. So what has actually happened here is that any potential revolutionary ability to direct that alienation upward is gone. You direct it now to your peers. So rather than having a bottom up class conscious rising that born out of material conditions, you have a woo-woo true self mindset, which has nothing to do, well, it has everything to do with material conditions in the sense that you can't live out, that mindset couldn't exist outside of capital. But from the point of view of the actor, the thinker, the feeler, it has nothing to do with material conditions. And so they just redirect all that energy away from capital in its defense, right? In its defense. That's the thing, right? Because what a lot of American leftists don't get is historic socialist countries, historic communist countries did not tolerate the Rainbow Coalition. For example, in the 80s, Jacob Smirnov made jokes about homosexuals in prison in the USSR, because that's what happened in a communist country. They would not tolerate this. So the next question is, if, and I don't think you can argue against this, if transgender identity is the result of capitalist material conditions, why would you assume it would exist under socialism? It wouldn't. And then second of all, why would that be a part of your socialist coalition? It shouldn't. So I think the other thing is, what a thing does, this is part of the broader subruption of the left to make it a little, drone you can point any way you want away from you, right? So there's a great video by V for Vendetta, or no, not V for Vendetta. I forget his name now. It was some anarchist guy who, and he had a video about the 1%, saying that what happened was the woke undermined Occupy Wall Street. It went from, classic class politics to identity politics. And he's like, this was all planned and staged and massaged by reporting and the news feeds and all of this stuff. And so that would be like the investigative journalism, if you will, that V Radio. The guy's name was V Radio. It's on YouTube. Check it out. And he's like, yeah, that's why they did this. And of course, the transgender identity is but one part of that whole broader woke identity. So now this whole the left, which used to be seen as a threat to the establishment, can now be used and contained and controlled. And I think this is the final piece in that puzzle.
Yeah, two things. One is that the question is what can we actually do, and I think one important point would be to to get the CEOs or other the C-suite of Twitch and Reddit and Discord, maybe even Steam, to get them in and question them where the money comes from. As we said in the beginning, follow the money, and then you find the donors that gave there. But somebody else told me recently he talked to a Swiss banker maybe a few years back, and that guy told him there's like 12 families in Switzerland that support everything or that basically are behind everything in society, and they wouldn't let anything happen that they don't like. So if you have a donor structure that are like maybe a dozen or so families, a dozen or so people that donate, it's very difficult to identify any nefarious activity, right? So basically, what Trump has done is designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, and now they could use RICO legislation to get behind the get get the dons basically like they did for the mafia. But it may not be as easy, right? Because I think the modern donors have much more plausible deniability than a mafia don who is like sitting in one building and has one, and everyone just the money all flows to that one guy, right? That guy is easier to identify than if you remember when they looked at US aid, there was like all kinds of different arrows going everywhere, right? Everyone was donating and receiving money from somewhere. Without AI, it would have been impossible to find who were actually the people that supported it. And I think they still haven't really found the basic structure underlying US aid, right? So it may be difficult, but I think going at the sponsors and donors would be an important step. That would be getting at the problem at the root. And LGBTQ didn't exist under 1980s style Soviet Union, but there were still people that were LGBTQ, right? Even it wasn't a mass movement. So I think maybe if you have a communist government of the future, they will try to make the LGBTQ movement into something that can rally conformity, and then that could be of advantage to them as well.
I mean, maybe. I think though, obviously in the 80s, no, but there were transvestites, I guess, in the United States. But transvestites and homosexuals went to jail in the Soviet Union. Communism did not tolerate this. But I think we'll end with this. As often happens sometimes, you're a couple drinks down and you're on Discord. I had this one night where I actually was talking to a bunch of transgender Marxists, and it was like I was like, guys, your entire ideology is your entire identity is rooted in capitalist ideology. Like you literally can't be a Marxist in transgender. And we went around for a while, but mostly they just like the fact that I listened to them and didn't shut them down. But one guy brought up Elagabalus, and I'm like, really? You're bringing up a Roman emperor? That's like the Roman Empire is the opposite of communism. And in fact, by the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was wealthy. It was the rule of the wealthiest classes. From a Marxist point of view, the Roman Empire is not something to emulate because it represents the rule of these wealthy classes who helped put, Caesar and then later Augustus into power. And so the point then becomes, this is like a kind of late stage decadence of wealthy aristocracy, wealthy nobility. And that's exactly what Elagabalus was. And so that was a real trip. It was a trip. But the point that I'm getting at is there is a massive disconnect between the material conditions that create this kind of thinking, because Elagabalus thought he was a woman, and what communism is, actually about. So it was one of those moments, but it was interesting. Final thoughts, Florian.
Yeah, as you said, communism and capitalism are useful as as paradigms to understand capital structures and money flows and so on. I think, and what also I remember how I almost offended, or they were very much offended when I told some left wingers in Germany that immigration is basically something that's in favor of capitalism is basically underlying immigration, and then no way, it's not capitalist. And, Yeah, so it's good to acknowledge the realities on the ground. But I think what I would imagine where an LGBTQ movement or transgender movement could try to move there, and maybe that's something they have in mind when they talk about communism and when they see themselves as transgender Marxists. Maybe something like Brave New World, right? Where people are actually like everything is love and peace and friendship, but everything like basically a dictatorship where everyone voluntarily resigns. And I think that's what they may have in mind, because to them they're all about accepting people and they're not dysfunctional at all. And there's always the evil right wingers that want to destroy them, but they're strong and they will prevail and so on. I think that's maybe what Aldous Huxley described is a little bit more likely as a societal future than what the author, I forgot his name, in Animal Farm in 1984 described. Which I
Orwell.
think Orwell, yeah, I think Orwell was more informed by real capitalist communist paradigms in terms of capital structures, and now it's maybe a little different, and so maybe just a little bit, but maybe Aldous Huxley's vision has more salience for the future. Also, maybe if you want Fahrenheit 451 as well, which is not Huxley, but you know the author.
Fahrenheit 451.
Yeah,
I should, but I don't.
but yeah, they're burning books
Yeah.
that they don't like. That's also sort of like a little bit. I see aspects of that as well. But yeah,
Yeah. One last thing. Somebody commented in the chat about my little story about the gay commies or the trans commies. And I said, look, I was engaging in internal critique with Foucauldian power language games of power. I mean, see, because the left never has the internal critique pivoted on them. And when you do that, they melt like ice cream in the sun. They can't handle that. That's why you do it. That's why you do it. You flip the internal critique angle and they're done. But yeah, thanks again, Florian. It's always a pleasure having you on.
pleasure's all mine.
This is Todd Lewis of the Prison Folly Podcast signing off.